Welcome to the Numbers Don't Tell Stories show. Each week, we like to give our listeners ideas on how to evaluate numbers through story. Our desire is to entertain you and provide you with useful insight. Welcome back to Numbers Don't Tell Stories. Great to have you back listening to our podcast. I'm Tom Etchison. That's Matthew Dix. We're your co-hosts for this adventure. And tonight we're going to look at something for this episode is kind of interesting from a numbers perspective. I'm gonna share a a thing that we brought in from social media, a news story that we brought in from social media here. And this is something that we find in business a lot. We find in news, social media, people use numbers to for shock value. And so you might be able to look at these numbers around diseases or disorders and think about them. This is showing the percentage increase, and this is floating around the vast interwebs, and so you can find this and look at it. And what's interesting in a business context, somebody might throw up a number around revenue. And the real story is, and I can remember doing this. I was working for a publicly traded company back a long time ago, and we would have to go, and I was part of a support team to the sales, a technical set of people that would go with the sales team to try to close deals with big companies. And I remember the salesperson that I went along with, I went and I visited him at his office in Silicon Valley. And I remember there was a guy who was walking. It was near the end of the quarter, and there was a guy walking up and down the hallway, carrying a baseball bat. And it was an imagery around like, hey, we got to make this quarter. And so you make the quarter, somebody puts up a revenue number, but nobody actually knows the story behind it. So there's this shock value, and there can be great benefit in seeing these huge numbers, and people don't really understand the things that go into making up those numbers. And so I think we use numbers for shock. And so you could look at these numbers and look at something like chronic fatigue syndrome up 11,000%. Well, in 1990, was that something anybody would admit to? Versus now, everybody thinks they're tired because we talk about it all the time. Right. And so there are things like that. So I see this, I see the reason why they put it up there, but I think most people look at that and they can't make sense of what an 11,000% increase. They can think about, oh, hey, eggs are 100% more than they were last year, right? That's a double in the price, but they can't make sense of 11,000.
No, and I would say that the first thing I notice on this set of numbers, this data set, is the heading, which I always pay attention to. So it says increase since 1990. What it really should say is increased diagnosis since 1990, because it's ridiculous to think that we are actually measuring rates of actual disease versus how much of this disease is being diagnosed. I think about autism, for example. My daughter happens to have autism, so I'm familiar with it. That rate of increase, 2,000%. If I think back to my childhood, I can think of the kids in my class who clearly had autism who did not get labeled as autistic because kids just sort of the awkward, lonely, socially, distant kids of my youth, probably. So I think a lot of this has to do more with our willingness to diagnose things, our willingness to admit to things, our attempt to get help for things. So, like, for example, if your grandmother had Alzheimer's in 1990, there may have not been the social supports available to take care of that grandmother or to give you, what
Right.
you needed. Whereas nowadays, maybe those social supports exist. So you're more likely to get your grandmother diagnosed so you can get some of the services that are available. So I always look at the heading first and say, how are they framing this argument? Because oftentimes it's being framed in the way the person who is presenting the data set wants it to be framed.
Right, and usually they're trying to use that shock to prove one point or another, whether it's political or whatever, and that's just the point associated with numbers is when you start recognizing, when you start slowing down, which is part of what we're trying to get people to do, is like, hey, you're seeing this now. I slow down and I start to think about this. Now there's more than just a passing, oh, well, this is just, somebody playing politics or somebody trying to shock me into doing something or whatever, manipulate me. I now start to ask questions around like, well, what does it mean to have an 11,000? Like, how could you even possibly get there, right?
Right.
And you start to question all of these things that you would have otherwise just bypassed previously. And I think that's so important here as you start to notice data and you start to say, okay, well, what could be the useful information that would help me consume this? Like your story around autism, like you now have a way of being able to go back in your memory banks and realize, oh, hey, this is something that was clearly present but wasn't necessarily diagnosed. It's always been there probably, but it's now, there may be an increase or various other things associated with it, along with, something like chronic fatigue or whatever. It's just a way of getting yourself comfortable with what questions could I ask? How could I find this? How could I get better educated around what does this mean?
Right. I think what I would advise to listeners is sort of the more shocking the number, the more distrust you should have around the number. It doesn't mean the number is not going to ultimately prove true and have value, but in my experience, just the more I am stunned by a number, the more I have to dig to make sure that I'm not purposely being stunned by that number in an attempt to, manipulate me, mitigate my feelings, convince me to think one way or another. The thing I always remind myself of when I'm looking at numbers like this, these stunning numbers, there's a gas station in my town. You have to drive to get to it, but it's always about 20 cents less than any other of the gas stations in town. And it's like the lowest gas you can kind of get in Connecticut. And so the lines are always endlessly long at this gas station. And my next door neighbor, I saw him leaving one day and, I said, "Hey, where are you going, Andrew?" And he said, "I'm going to go get gas on the Berlin Turnpike because it's the cheapest you can get." And I said, "Well, it's going to be like a 10-minute drive to get there and you're probably going to have to wait." And he goes, "I know, but it's the cheapest." And I said, "Well, how big is your gas tank?" And he said, it's 12 gallons. And I said, "All right, so you're going to save 20 cents on 12 gallons of gas. How much money are you saving during your 20-minute drive and 10-minute wait to get the gas? Like you're making $2.40 for
Right.
30 minutes of effort, And he paused for a minute and then he said, "Yeah, I'm going to do it anyway." Um, but like that's the idea that like we look at a number and we go, "Wow, 20 cents less than anywhere else. Why would I not go and get gas there?" And maybe you should. Maybe if you are
Right.
pinching pennies, that's maybe something you should do. But again, a shocking number like that, you take a step back and you ask what it really means, and pretty soon you realize you're not making a lot of money through all that effort.
Right. And you, most people, never do the math, right? So like if you're presenting, that there's some massive increase in your financial results or something like that, immediately somebody's going to question that. Like, you're immediately going to have to review that number and make sure, okay, well, what's behind that, if you have some astounding result, and there's this, I think, reluctance in a lot of cases to actually do the math and make sense of what does this mean in in service of your gas example, like there's no way for most people that that's going to make any sense unless you're buying hundreds of gallons.
Right.
And that's what's so interesting, that we think we're saving money, but people don't know how to value their time. They don't know how to put a value to a variety of things, and so it's just better to ignore it, which again gets you back to these things. Like, now you're going to recognize, hopefully after hearing that story about the gas, or hearing about these crazy shocking numbers associated with diagnoses, that you're now all of a sudden thinking to yourself, oh, what is the math behind that?
Right. Yeah.
Should I care about that?
My son once, looking at that famous gas station on the Berlin Turnpike in Connecticut, we drove by it once, and my son said, how come there's always landscaper trucks at that gas station? Which is exactly what you just said, right? So I told my son, people line up at that gas station because it's the cheapest gas. It doesn't make sense unless we happen to be driving by it to get gas there. But for landscapers who are filling trucks and lawnmowers and leaf blowers, like, they are literally buying hundreds of gallons of gas per week, probably, to do their work. So for them, it makes sense. So it's so interesting how that number tells a story in both ways. Like, if my son understands the meaning behind the number, he can answer the question himself, why are the landscaping trucks always at that gas station? So just doing that math will sort of just make the world seem a little more sensible to you, and you won't drive by something just wondering why it is the way it is.
Yeah, and it's fascinating that he recognized that, because number one, it's a pattern, and number two, that pattern provides the answer.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's where the the benefit is. That's where the value is. And so I think what we were trying to talk about and talk through is this notion of shock, and do you pay attention to it? Do you take the time to do the math? Do you take the time to go and dig into it, or do you take action just based on being shocked?
Right.
And
Yeah.
and I think what we're trying to counsel is that in most cases, that shock is probably not worth this, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. And so you have to dig, and you have to do a little bit of work, and you have to think it through. And I think that's kind of the point of this episode, and the stories behind that. That was, it's really informative, and you have to start thinking, in your own life, what are your gas station moments? What are your sales moments? A lot of people can identify with end of quarter type stuff, like, hey, we beat our estimates, but what did we have to give up to get there?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And, numbers like this just tell you, once you sort of put some thought into them, they also just tell you, if you can figure out who put these numbers out, what they're aiming at, what their angle is, right? You can really sort of drill down into someone's motivation without ever speaking to them, just by understanding how they choose to frame data in a way that, tries to get you to think something. You can pretty quickly determine the kind of thought process that goes into something like this and what they're hoping to get from it. So not only can you make sense of the data, but you can start to understand the person who's presenting the data. And I think that's also very useful.
Well, and to that point, like, just to kind of wrap this up with that gas station example, there may be a reason why that gas station is trying to attract the landscaper trucks, right? Because they're going in and getting the Monster drinks and various other things, and at various points during their day, and maybe that's a much higher margin for them in some ways, and they're bringing in that recurring revenue by attracting those folks back through their doors. And
Yeah,
so,
I had I talked to my son what a loss leader was, and I said,
right.
Basically, the price of gas is almost insignificant to a gas station. It's all the other things that you're going inside and purchasing where they're making most of their profits. So yeah, that gas station might actually be losing money on their gas, but making a windfall on everything else that's being purchased.
Right. Great episode. Thanks, Matthew, for playing along, and we'll can't wait to do the next one.
Yeah, can't wait.
Thanks. You've reached the end of the show. We ask that if you found this useful, that you please tell a friend. Leave us a 5-star review on the podcast platform of your choice. And if you're watching us via YouTube, please like and subscribe.